Well, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here.
And I was toying with opening with Critical Drinker. Welcome to the show, or Will, welcome to the show. But I guess we've got both in today's recording.
Yeah, it's the duality of man right here. I am the drinker and I'm Will Jordan at the same time, so it's messing with my head a little bit.
Yeah, I like it though, and I think it gives you license to maybe be even more forthright when there's an element of a persona or an alias that sits alongside it that you could put yourself out there as.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, I mean, to some extent, you're playing a role, but a lot of the time, it's just like an amped up, over the top version of yourself, anyway. But I don't know, it just allows you to be a little bit more free and just say the kind of things that a lot of people want to say. So I find it great fun.
I really like it, and like I was saying to you before we hit record, I really resonate with a lot of the forthright takes that you're putting out there. That, as you say, they seem very common sense and they seem very to the letter and very, very clear. But there's a narrative that you're almost pushing back on that so many of us don't agree with, but we're almost being told from on high that we should agree with. And it's an unusual situation we find ourselves in.
Yeah, I don't know at what point that free thinking and questioning ideas and just being a little bit more critical of things that you hear just went out of fashion, and you were expected to just believe everything that you were told and just accept everything that you're told. But when I started my channel and I started critiquing movies, it's not like I did it with any kind of goal in mind. It's not like I was starting some kind of movement or anything ridiculous like that. I just wanted to speak my mind. And, it was myself just realizing, like, no, it shouldn't be like this. Like, we shouldn't just accept garbage movies or garbage TV shows or whatever else, or the message, as I've come to put it. And then it took off in such a crazy way. I realized, like, oh, right, it's not just me then. I'm not on my own here. And I'm not some just crazy guy who's like ranting at nothing. There's a lot of people who share similar views. And that was nice. And there's so many people who've got in touch with me over the years saying something similar. You've articulated something that I was thinking, or it's great to know that I'm not the only one who noticed this about modern entertainment. And that's a good feeling, so people realize that, yeah, you're not on your own and you're not losing your mind. There's problems with what we entertain ourselves with these days.
It's very reassuring, as you say. And I guess when we're using the term modern, what are we using as our cutoff from when we think cinema and TV and stuff started to take a turn for the worse?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously going to depend who you ask on this one. I think if I was to make a general demarcation line, it would probably be around about 2015. I think that's when it really became obvious that, one, the quality of the writing was starting to go downhill. Two, they were starting to rely more and more on remakes, rehashes of existing ideas, resurrecting all these old franchises that people used to enjoy when they were kids, and the injection of more and more identity politics into media. I think that's when it became really noticeable and really just started to take precedent over the story. And that's the point where people start to get annoyed at it. And I certainly started to notice it then.
Yeah, I certainly think people would have noticed it at that point, but I guess the annoyance at it probably comes after a period of time when those have been produced for a period. And I've heard you speak before that the lead time on cinema is maybe 3 years from the public reaction. People will then start to produce films that are more in line with what the public want. Now, we haven't quite seen that yet, but it's very important that when people respond to a piece of art or a piece of theatre or a piece of film or a piece of TV, there is a lead time for those that are creating it to respond to that. And albeit at the moment it feels like they've very much got their fingers in their ears and disregarding that, there is still that element of, from 2015 to now, there should have been some sort of reaction because the people clearly are not particularly enamored with what they're seeing.
I think so. I mean, generally speaking, the films continue to make money, though, and that was the deciding factor for a lot of these studios. You might get pushback from curmudgeons on YouTube or whoever, but if you're still raking in billions of dollars with your movies, you're not going to care that much, because ultimately you're going to see the bottom line profit and loss and think, well, we're doing the right thing because we're making tons of money. Certainly Disney were doing that with the Marvel Cinematic Universe. They were churning out billion-dollar movies on a 2 or 3 times a year. It was insane the amount of money they were making. Same with Star Wars. It was very successful initially, so they had no reason to complain. but it's a cumulative effect, I suppose. And it's the same with public perception of it. You can forgive a certain amount of this stuff. You can forgive a certain amount of, oh, that's very hackneyed storytelling. Well, who cares? I'm having fun. Or, wow, it's kind of weird that they felt the need to make this political point for no apparent reason, but whatever. I can look past that and enjoy the movie. But when it starts to happen 3, 4, 5, 6 times, then it starts to build up in your mind, and you think, no, this just sucks now. And so that's the kind of pushback that you're starting to see. And when you get to the point where South Park are making fun of you and just straight up calling out the crap that you're doing, it's mainstream then, and everyone's got license then to make fun of you for it. And I think it then is no longer a taboo thing to mention. And so this is what you're seeing, that the pushback has only gathered pace in the past year or so.
That's a great point. There's a tipping point, isn't there, Will, where everyone is willing to be seen to be critical. And I definitely think, like, if I look at maybe how the handling of the pandemic, I see a lot of people now putting their heads above the parapet to criticize it.
Yeah.
But in the heat of the battle, they maybe didn't say anything. In the same way, some of the trans athletes in sports and that sort of debate, many people kind of let it go for a particular period, and then it starts to maybe come closer to home. And that's when you're like, well, actually, I would rather my daughter had single sex changing space, and that's when the point when you've started to draw the battle lines.
I think so, and it's a brave person that speaks out against the narrative, particularly with really divisive political issues, like whether it's trans athletes, whether it's feminism or racism or whatever you want to talk about in movies, or like you mentioned there, the COVID stuff. It's a very brave person who's going to speak about that in the heat of the moment, because they can. Careers were ended, particularly during the lockdowns. You could straight up be fired from your job for saying the wrong thing about that. Now it's become a lot safer to talk about it and to critique it. But yeah, it was a dangerous thing for a long time, and so the people who actually did speak out about that stuff back then, they got a lot of respect. I think they should be afforded for what they did.
Yes, I certainly think so. And we're kind of using the term the narrative, we're using the term the message, and that's obviously something that comes up on your channel a lot of the time. Why do you think it is that Hollywood is turned towards pushing this particular type of ideology onto the watchers and the viewers?
It was probably a lot of things that happened around about the same time. I think that period of like 2015, 2016, you had two major things. One was the Harvey Weinstein thing, where obviously a lot of stuff came out about how male executives, particularly in Hollywood, abuse their power. Pretty disgusting stuff, really. I think it's things that a lot of us suspected for a long time anyway, but to actually hear it. So there was that. There was obviously then a knee-jerk reaction from Hollywood to say, well, actresses and so on and female characters have been underrepresented. We need to prove how virtuous we are, and we're going to put them front and center of everything. And also, I guess, Trump getting elected in 2016, huge pushback from Hollywood. I think it sent shockwaves through that whole industry and that whole town, because, for better or worse, Hollywood is a very left-leaning industry, always has been. And so those two things combined, they could not help themselves. They went into an absolute frenzy of injecting politics into everything. And, it was almost, well, it did become a meme eventually, where every time there was a villain character and the writers were there to talk about their inspiration for it, it's like, well, I'm willing to bet that this guy is a representation of Donald Trump, isn't he? And sure enough, he was, like, every single time. And it's just like, it became ludicrous how, like, completely lacking in imagination they were. But this is what happened. They just drove themselves into an absolute frenzy, and it just got worked into everything that they did. It was kind of hilarious after a point.
I think it becomes laughable because it becomes a bee in their bonnet rather than something that the audience are particularly concerned about hearing about. And it is interesting you bring up Weinstein, because it was such a colossal news story, and the reverberations of it are going to continue for a long period of time thereafter. But there's an element of, like, the pendulum always swings back. So Initially they went so far to be like, oh no, we're now massively pro-women. We're creating a safe space for female actresses to excel. And then at some point you expect that to come back to some sort of equilibrium where we have equal opportunities and support. But I don't know if we've actually had that pendulum swinging back moment yet where people have maybe said, right, okay, we were being reactionary to a really challenging event and we needed to make some change, but the change that we made was so far over the top and almost out of line with the issue in the first place, because we're talking about a bad entity rather than like the entire culture, albeit I'm sure there'll be far more that didn't get exposed that
Yeah.
were up to similar tricks.
And I think it's always interesting the number of A-list actresses, particularly, who kind of knew about this stuff but decided not to speak out because that would mean putting their own ass on the line. And it comes back to that whole thing about you only speak out when it's safe to do so. And then, well, you're not being particularly brave if that's the case. But fair enough.
Let the pile on begin, as you would say. Yeah.
Exactly. Once it's safe to rag on this stuff, it's like, oh yes, I deplore all of this stuff. It's like, well, yeah, you didn't have a problem with that like 20 years ago when it was helping your career, but okay, fine. Anyway, that's by the by. But yeah, the problem that it created is twofold. One, they overcompensated, like you said, by trying to bring about the girl boss archetype, which I've talked about on my channel, various other people have, where it's just very like superficially strong female characters that are just amazing at everything and they can beat the guys hands down at everything. They don't have any weaknesses, and it results in terrible storytelling. And it's certainly an archetype that's run its course now. I think it was Emily Blunt who actually spoke out about this initially, just saying, I will flat out turn down a script that says there's a strong female lead in it because it's so nondescript. It's such a crap piece of writing. It's like you're just relying on the fact that the character's strong, not interesting, not driven, not multifaceted, just strong. That's nothing. People don't latch onto that.
Multifaceted is such a key term there, Will, and that for me is what we connect with characters when they have depth, when we can relate to their story. And one of the challenges I believe with the message, and you've called this out so many times, is with, for example, a strong female lead, there's no element of struggle or self-improvement or reflection. It's a case of they're perfect as they are to start with. They've just been oppressed by other entities and the patriarchy and all these difficult systems. And then suddenly they smash through this and they excel and they beat everyone without doing any sort of form of self-work or development. And I was telling you when we were getting arranged for this, my audience are very much self-development, personal development, working on yourself, trying to excel. And people like myself and the listeners, we don't connect with a story where somebody just suddenly starts believing in themselves and it radically changes everything. It just feels like fairy tale nonsense.
Yeah, and certainly if your central struggle is basically not that you have to improve yourself to overcome a challenge in the world, but rather the world has to just learn to cope with how awesome you are, that's not teaching people very productive lessons, and it's not arming them for life, I suppose, because life is going to throw a lot of challenges at you. And guess what? When you get out into the real world, there is a ton of people out there who are smarter than you, more skilled than you, more talented than you. And what you're going to do, you can either work to improve yourself so that you can compete with them and do well in life, or you can just crumble because you were told that you were amazing the way you are. I know which lesson is more useful to me and probably for any other person out there. And that's what movies, I guess, used to teach us. That was the struggle of the main character, having to rise above their origins, to rise above where they are at the beginning, to go on a journey and become a better, stronger, more capable person by the end. That's the essence of storytelling. And if you remove that, you remove the story. So that's not much, doesn't leave the audience much to grapple with then, I suppose. And that's why people have rejected so many of these characters, because they're not characters. They're just wish fulfillment fantasies from the writers.
Why do you think the writers have that particular view or drive? Appreciate they're maybe lashing back at Trump or Weinstein or whatever, but what's the driver?
I think because it was actually the second part of the problem that I was going to describe earlier. It was like, one, the reaction was that they create like these girl boss characters, and two, they promote a whole bunch of writers into positions that they're absolutely either not qualified for or not ready for, because their rationale is, we just need more diverse writers in the writing room. We need to get like as many boxes ticked as possible. And so we bring in all these people who either haven't had the experience to become good at their craft. They haven't taken the time to hone their skills as artists, or they're essentially just activists who say the right thing, they tick the right boxes, and then all they care about is pushing their own particular activist viewpoints. They don't care about telling a good story. If they're working within a franchise, they don't care about respecting that franchise or the history of it or the other characters. All they care about is pushing their particular message, and they'll do it by any means necessary. And that is a deathly combination for any story. So that I think is the main problem that you've got there. The writers either can't or won't do their jobs properly now.
I'm glad you brought us back to that second point, because I think that is really fundamental, and I think many of us will have seen the leaked footage from the Disney. It was Senior Vice President Michael Giordano, and he was talking about if you're too white, you won't be hired.
Yeah.
And he himself, even though he's quite senior, recognizes that as a white man, he is almost against Disney's DEI policy, which would see him get further career progression. And that, I guess, speaks to a lot of what you're saying there, where some of the writers who are getting into these positions are there to try and increase the diversity or to tick a particular box. And that for me is just so disingenuous. And I don't think I've ever wanted to achieve anything in life that's been given to me, albeit as a straight white man. I'm probably not going to be given that. But I can put myself in those shoes and think, oh goodness me, I really wouldn't want to be in a position that I didn't feel like I merited.
Well, I think as well, like I'm fully in favor of giving people from all different backgrounds and all different demographics a fair shot to succeed, because I don't think you should have a writer's room that's just all white men or whatever. But I think it has to be balanced out by the competency of the people that you're hiring. And I'm really not in favor of taking opportunities away from one group who might actually be the most qualified or whatever, and giving it to someone else just arbitrarily. So you're essentially like ruining people's careers and stifling their ability to succeed in life just because you've decided certain other people need it more. That's not really fair. I think there needs to be a more gradual change with this. I think perhaps that's part of the problem. They've tried to have an instant overnight solution to this issue that's been going on for decades and generations. You're not going to fix it overnight. And ultimately what they're doing is just creating more problems than it's solving. And yeah, I really don't like that. I mean, that interview with the senior vice president at Disney was just so illuminating. I mean, we knew this stuff was happening anyway. We all suspected it, but to hear it just straight up
From the
said out
horse's
loud,
mouth.
yeah, I mean, that's pretty grim. I mean, to be working at a company like that, knowing, hey, like they actively hate me because of how I'm born. Like I can't even do anything about it. But like I guess there's a bunch of options and there's a bunch of opportunities that just aren't going to come my way, and I just have to accept that. Great, that doesn't seem very fair.
No, it doesn't. And I think at that point, I think you're complicit in supporting something that you shouldn't be supporting. But I think he's senior enough that he's quite happy. He's kind of getting what he wants to get, albeit he knows that there's a particular ceiling to it. And I've heard you say before, and I would completely agree with this, the composition of a team that creates a movie shouldn't matter whatsoever. It's the end product that we're the most interested in. And I found myself nodding along when you've said that on the channel or you've said it on other podcasts. And I really think that the sum of the parts isn't that important. And I would much rather enjoy what's been created rather than be like, oh, it's fantastic that this had this number of women or this number of people from disadvantaged backgrounds or this number of people from this ethnic group. Like, I'm not really too fussed. And I agree that I think it would probably be quite a boring film if everyone in the writing room was exactly the same and came from the same backgrounds. But diversity of thought for me would be far more valuable than diversity of different colors or creeds.
Absolutely. And look at one of the most successful films of last year, Godzilla Minus One, like relative to its budget. Budget was tiny, like 15 million, made like 10, 15 times that. A completely ethnically homogenous cast and probably the writing team and everything as well. All Japanese. No one cares. It's a good movie. It's fun. That's all we need. And particularly because we're surrounded by, like, I imagine for most people, if they work for any big company, they're surrounded by DEI initiatives, all kinds of like inclusion initiatives. They get it on the news 24/7. They don't necessarily need it in their entertainment as well. Like, that is where we go to escape and just lose ourselves in a story. And the moment you become aware that, this person was put there because of that reason, or this character is particularly good at this thing because, X, Y, and Z rules dictate that they must be, you're taken out of the story, you're taken out of the escapism, and you're just seeing a diversity and inclusion initiative on screen in front of you. That's all it comes down to.
I think that's one of the reasons that your content resonates so much and has gathered such a large following on YouTube, because we just feel like, why are you doing this to something that I'm meant to enjoy in my leisure time? As you say, we've had identity politics creep into the corporate world to an extent that many of us are uncomfortable with. To then try to escape from that and watch something you want to watch and relax and unwind, and then you're suddenly feeling like you're being force-fed by a fire hydrant, the same sort of stuff that you are trying to get away from. It's distasteful to a large extent. I think that's why when somebody like yourself speaks, albeit sometimes gets quite ranty and quite animated, I think we just like, brilliant, like you're speaking for us well at that point.
Yeah, I think there's a real catharsis to be found in someone just articulating what you're thinking. And hopefully doing it in a funny or sort of entertaining way, which is what I strive for, you know, and hence the reason, like, it can be a bit ranty and a bit like, you know, hyperbolic at times, but that's what makes it enjoyable, I suppose. And people, I think, really latch onto that, like you say, to have someone articulate what you're feeling. You know, there's obviously a lot of people out there who agree with it, because I guess I've been lucky my channel has done particularly well.
Yeah, we feel seen at that point. And speaking of like different quotas and diversity things that people apply for, you shared the tweet from BBC's hiring program for their Extend program,
Yeah.
where
I remember this.
where they asked that people who apply must specifically identify as either disabled, neurodivergent, or dead.
Yeah.
I mean, where do we go from here, Will?
Yeah, I mean, I'm assuming I'm going to cut them a little bit of slack here and assume it was some kind of weird typo, but I do love that idea that I can apply for a job at the BBC and say that I apply as I identify as dead. You know, so brilliant.
That worries me, because that's exclusion rate, and not the dead piece, but just in general, the way that they're marketing these roles, it's like switching off from another area, and like people who are applying for that, there's not the same sense of like achievement when you get those roles. And I'm like, as you said, I would be a really big proponent of giving people incredible opportunities and giving them support to get to the levels they want to get to. But when it's done on a level that's just so blatantly like a hand up while putting a hand down on somebody else,
Yeah.
I don't see how it computes.
Yeah, I think so. And it seems like the kind of thing that's going to create bad blood within a company, because it's going to create jealousy and resentment amongst the people who are not the beneficiaries of these kind of, you know, hand ups. I'd perhaps even, you know, lack of respect towards the people who have succeeded, perhaps on their own merits entirely. But then there's going to be that question mark of like, oh, did you only get that promotion because you ticked this box or that box? So it's going to make them feel bad about themselves. And I just feels like one of those situations where nobody really wins from it. You know, yeah, you created some superficial veneer of a diverse workforce or whatever, but you're not fixing the problem fundamentally at a cultural level. And I just,
Yeah.
again, it's just trying to put a band-aid on a big major wound. You know, it's not fixing it.
Agreed. You mentioned remakes earlier, Will, and that kind of post 2015 period where there was an awful lot of remakes. Now, that was a tried and tested formula almost throughout cinema history, where things that have worked, there's been some element sometimes of remaking them. But some of the remakes that we've had in recent years have been done to an appalling level, and we've almost like soured our memories of the previous one. Why do you think that's been?
Because they've been crap, really. And I think when you get to that point, like, it happens with major franchises as well. Like, say, taking Star Wars, for example. You know, everyone had fond memories of the original movies when they were kids watching them, which is all good. And so it was a brand that had a lot of strong positivity.
Equity.
Yeah, like a lot of equity and a lot of fans who were just very engaged with it. But you start producing new content, which is low quality. People start to question whether you're the right people to be making it. And then if it carries on and it gets to the point where there's more bad content than good content, you devalue the brand itself to the point where people start to disengage even from the older stuff. Like the whole thing gets pulled down by this shocking decline in quality. So there is that. And I don't think, generally speaking, remakes have ever been particularly successful, unless it's a film or a TV show that had a great premise but just terrible execution. You know, so there's been a few ones like, I don't know, Battlestar Galactica in the 2000s. Like the original TV show was some goofy 1970s, you know, piece of campy cheese. But the idea was okay. They updated it into a modern framework, made it much more grim, dark,
Better technology
serious
as well to shoot the thing. I agree there. That's a great point.
So that's an example of where it's a good idea to do a remake. You know, the Zack Snyder did that Dawn of the Dead remake. I mean, it was fine. I'd argue it was a bit pointless because the original one was pretty good. But anyway, it's an example where it can work. But generally speaking, they're picking things like Ghostbusters, right? They did a remake of the Ghostbusters movie. Why? It's one of the most beloved films of the 1980s. You're not going to improve on that. What's the point? You're setting yourself up to fail immediately. because you're going to obviously invite comparisons with the original. And if the original is really good, you've made it almost impossible to succeed. So yeah, I don't know why they keep doing it. I guess it's just trying to capitalize on the brand identity and the inbuilt audience, but they fail time after time.
I think it's important you bring up the likes of Star Wars, because while it's not necessarily a remake, it's an extension of the franchise.
Yeah.
And I think you've had ample material for your channel just with the absolute omni shambles clusterfuck that is
Yeah.
Star Wars. And I have such fond memories of the first trilogy, and because I was quite young when Phantom Menace and stuff came out, I actually quite enjoyed them for what they were.
Yeah.
And I appreciate they're not great for compared to the original trilogy in terms of the storytelling and the depth and whatnot. But the latest round and then all the different spin-off series, actually hard to watch. And in fact, I don't even think I went to see the kind of third and penultimate or kind of final one that came out in the cinema. I just decided, I think I'm finished with this.
I don't blame you. I mean, I think in years to come, they are going to study this at universities and stuff in terms of brand management, in terms of business decisions. The management of Star Wars is going to go down as one of the biggest piece of brand suicides in the history of entertainment, because you took something that was essentially like a cornerstone of pop culture. You could go to anyone pretty much anywhere in the world and say, who's Darth Vader or who's Luke Skywalker? They're probably going to know, even if they've never really watched Star Wars. It's just permeated the culture to the point where everyone knows about it. You go to them now and say, who's Kylo Ren or who's Finn or Poe Dameron? Nobody's going to know. Nobody like who's not directly engaged with those movies is going to know about those things. There's no cultural imprint now, and they've moved beyond even that. They've descended below the levels of even movies to the point where Star Wars as a brand now is just a bunch of crappy TV shows on an obscure streaming service that's slowly dying. That's what it is now. It's nothing. There's no value to that brand anymore.
Remarkable, isn't it? And the thing that struck me, and I've heard you articulate this really well, was in that latest round of the three films, heroes like Luke Skywalker and Han Solo were then painted as old, troubled, grim, bitter men who weren't as capable as they once were, or maybe weren't even capable at all, and they almost cast aspersions on the feats that came before them. And I found that, I mean, I guess it links into the whole message where like men are trash piece, or they maybe had their success because of a patriarchy that put them there, despite it being somewhere else in the galaxy than Earth, of course. And I found that really challenging to deal with. And as somebody who had fond memories of Luke Skywalker as a hero and Han Solo as this swashbuckling pilot flying through the galaxy, I was like, why have you done this now?
I think one of the key elements of building up, whether it's a new culture or a new franchise, is to tear down all the objects of resistance in your path. And in this case, it's going to be the reverence for the heroes of the past. Once you undermine people's faith in them, not just by humiliating in the present, but as you say, deconstructing even the legend of them, so that you're made to believe like, oh, maybe Luke Skywalker really wasn't much of a hero in the first place. Maybe Han Solo was always going to be a deadbeat dad. It makes it a lot easier to replace them when people no longer have those fond memories of them. And once you see what they're trying to do with things like that, it's really quite disgusting. Particularly because none of this stuff would even exist if it wasn't for those characters. You know, they wouldn't even have a franchise to desecrate if it wasn't for the achievements of, previous generations of writers who were able to craft these characters. And yeah, man, it's a depressing thing to watch. But once you recognize it, it becomes a lot easier to call it out. And that's, I guess, one of the big motivating factors of why I made my channel and why I talk about the things that I do. It's one thing to just create bad media that's just brand new. You know, I don't dislike people for doing that. It's like you tried to create something, it's not very good, whatever. You know, you tried. But when you stand on the shoulders of giants and take a big old dump on them and complain about everything that they did in the process while adding nothing of value of your own, yeah, that's when I get pissed off. So that's what causes me to stir myself from my drunken stupor.
Yeah, and I think that's why your videos on the latest series, is it the Acolyte it's called? It's just
Yeah.
so far they're just so popular because people know they're going to log on and watch this video where you just deconstruct it, and not just from a this is crap perspective, but you're critiquing everything about it, even the depth of the story and just how well it's conducted as well. And I guess what I find funny is that you're a voice of the people. But if we go to the likes of Rotten Tomato, I had a look, the Acolyte is 83% rating by the critics and 14% by the audience. And that's something that I've seen reflected across many of the different modern movies and modern TV series that we're seeing. Where does this discrepancy come from the so called professional critics and just us, the general watchers and the viewers?
Well, I think if anything good has come out of this whole period that we're in with entertainment, it's the slow destruction of people's faith in professional critics. Because what they are is just fucking shills. Like, their opinions are bought and paid for. They don't really believe any of the stuff that they're saying. It's just a case of you get access to all those lovely premieres and all the goodie baskets and all kinds of incentives and access to our actors and stuff for interviews. If you're a media outlet and you give us a nice positive review and just play the game, and that's what they've done. And the problem is, real people don't think that way, and normal people, like even just YouTubers like me, we don't get access to any of this stuff. We don't get to interview, like, Ewan McGregor about his work on Obi-Wan Kenobi or anything like that. I don't care though. I don't need that. But what I can do is give an honest opinion on what I think is wrong with these shows or these movies or whatever. And nobody writes my paychecks for that. And so it's tremendously freeing. But then we're the people that end up getting trusted and believed. And what you're seeing now is so many of these media sites they're dying. They're just empty shells of what they used to be. You'll have insane situations where they've got 5-6 million subscribers on YouTube and they'll struggle to break 50,000 views per video. Nobody's watching them anymore. Nobody cares what they have to say. So yeah, bring it on. Like, they've brought about their own demise through their own greed. So I've got no sympathy for them.
You mentioned the economics of the box office earlier, and the reason they could continue with the kind of narrative and the agenda that they were pushing was that the numbers were reflecting them to be able to do that. But it comes a point where that's not the case. And I really think that when you see tipping points like that, where the critics are just so far off the mark in terms of what the audience felt and what they felt, albeit they may not truly feel that they're doing that for access and for perks, etc. But I believe to some extent they're probably like tricking themselves into believing that was a great film, or it's ideologically aligned with them. So they're like, okay, it's a great film, you should all enjoy this, and like almost lecturing down from on high. And I'm a big proponent of pushing back against the whole do as I say, not as I do piece. And I find a lot of these people from the kind of liberal elites are very keen to lecture down from above on the virtues of, I don't know, identity politics, climate change, and all this kind of stuff that typically comes out of their
Yeah, I mean,
trap.
well, how many people forced us to stay in our houses, and how many people were prevented from being with their loved ones when they passed away from COVID, while the people doing the lecturing were going to parties and just living their lives as they saw fit. Wow, that was a real eye opener, I think, for a lot of people, and it filters into all aspects of this stuff. I think there's been a real sea change in our perception of celebrity, of organized kind of media outlets, that kind of traditional model of authority, I suppose. Like, how many people used to look up to movie stars? They were seen as like, you know, pearls of wisdom. They were so much smarter than the rest of us, and they were these untouchable beings. And then we actually got to hear their everyday thoughts when social media came along and listen to all their dumb opinions about things, and it just destroyed it. It burst that bubble, and now we have a very different perception of them. Hence, it probably hastened the demise of the very movie star concept that we used to have, where you'd go and see the latest Tom Cruise movie or you go and see the latest Arnold Schwarzenegger movie. We don't have that anymore. That's changed. We don't.
There has been a fall of stars, and you speak really well about that, Will, and I really do agree. And you're naming Tom Cruise and you're naming Arnold Schwarzenegger. It'd be really difficult for somebody now to name somebody in the same caliber, same bracket from the last tranche of 10, 15 years of films that I can think of.
Yeah, it doesn't exist anymore. For a while, I think The Rock tried to kid himself that he was the next like Arnold Schwarzenegger or whoever. But then most people can't even name one of his films. Like, it's just absurd. He makes insane amounts of money, but like there's no cultural footprint there whatsoever. And it's, yeah, we don't have that anymore.
Or iconic lines that he says in the
Yeah.
same way as Schwarzenegger is Terminator. I completely agree. And that's even what you were saying about the cultural footprint of Star Wars. You may not know Star Wars, but somebody will know if you say, "Look, I am your father." They know where that comes from. Whereas, like, think of modern films where the lines permeate society in the way that those do. Almost none.
No. And look at, because the money's has been there as well. Like, say, I don't know, Avatar, right? Biggest movie
Mm.
of all time. Nobody can name the characters in it. Nobody, there's no iconic lines, nothing like that. Like you say, there's no cultural footprint whatsoever. It's just a thing that a bunch of people went to see and then forgot about. You know, and so yeah, we don't have that anymore, I don't think. And it's, I don't know what changes, and I don't know how we get that back again, but we could really do with it, because we can't keep referencing movies from the 1980s forever. Like, we need new stuff to influence our culture, you know?
Yeah, we absolutely do. And I think that whole social media and access piece is something that it unfortunately stops you being able to separate the art from the artist. And one person that's done that for me is Robert De Niro's bizarre speech in a sort of anti-Trump rant, which
Yeah.
I'm absolutely fine if you're not in favor of Trump and you're pro Biden or whatever else. But the way he did it, and the way he lectured people, and he said that, oh, we're going to have a dictatorship and whatnot, which is just factually nonsense. It was remarkable to watch somebody that, like, I think of so many films he was in that I really respect because of the generation he's from and because of the generation of cinema he's from. But watching him just bumble around almost as some sort of paid shill for the Democratic Party was painful.
That man has done so much damage to his reputation, both as an actor and just, I guess, as a person over the past several years. More than that, actually, I suppose, because he went through this period as well where he was just starring in absolute garbage movies. Like, I don't know, I think he got fleeced in his divorce or something. Maybe he needed the money, but man, to go from like one of the most respected actors, not just of his generation, but of all time, to
Ever.
starring in like Bad Grandpa or whatever else he did, um, that hurts you after a while. And yeah, just going on these insane rants about politics and things, like as you say, you can have political opinions, and there's plenty of places where you can do it, but you can articulate it in a smart way. And if it just ends up looking like a confused old man who's just angry about something and he doesn't even really know what, like, it's not a good look. You know, I think Mark Hamill's fallen into that trap as well, where I remember after the new Star Wars movies came out, I followed him on Twitter for a while because I was like, you know, I want to hear from Luke Skywalker about his experiences with the new movies, what he thinks of them. And it was just non-stop politics. It was non-stop talking points. And I just, yeah, I unfollowed him after a few weeks. I just couldn't listen to it anymore because it was just so tedious. It was the same stuff over and over again.
It's the groupthink of Hollywood as well. As you said, them seeing Trump elected in 2016 was such a shock to the system because of the echo chamber they operate within. And that's a real shame, because that's sometimes why a Brexit or a Trump happens, because people who are in our cultural elite, who tend to shape opinion to some extent or have an influence on it, were so far detached from what the everyday person was thinking or feeling at that point that it almost hit them as like a tsunami of surprise. And one of the examples I always talk about is, if you were on Twitter, as it was called in 2019, you would have thought that Corbyn was going to win a landslide. Now, I appreciate it's been reversed this time round in the UK general election, but sometimes there's such strong echo chambers, and a lot of the elites sit within that. They become so detached from what the actual public sentiment is.
Yeah, I think particularly with social media, it was very heavily moderated and censored to a degree, so that like there was only really one viewpoint that was ever getting any sort of traction on that, and it fools people, I think, into believing that that's the general sentiment of the public, and it's quite often not the case. And I think you're only seeing now a bit of a reversal of that because, you know, Elon Musk bought it over and he's instituted a lot of changes that allows like just people to be able to express themselves a bit more freely, and like it's a bit more of a meritocracy when it comes to ideas now, which is nice.
It is nice, and that's exactly what we're after. And when we're talking about the discrepancy there between critics' views and probably the actors' views and the public's views and the audience's views, there's a term that I learned from you called fan baiting.
Mm-hmm.
What does that involve?
So, in a nutshell, it's if you're going to announce some new project, you might perhaps do a remake of some old classic that people remember. You race and gender swap the main character, and you are very public and very vocal about the fact that you're doing that, You wait for the inevitable complaints from the fans, because that's not the franchise they remember. It's not the character they remember, and they know you're just doing it for political reasons. You cherry pick the most extreme examples that you can find, and then send that to the access media and say, look how racist and sexist or bigoted all these fans are being. They just can't handle, change. And then the media runs with the story. Everyone talks about it. It creates a big firestorm, and it gets you lots and lots and lots of free publicity for your project. And then it almost guarantees that the media themselves are going to be super friendly towards it, because nobody wants to criticize the movie that's got a diverse star in it, because they don't want to be accused of being an hysterophobe either. So it's a
They
wonderful
feel like they're
little,
on the right side.
yeah. So it's a wonderful little self-perpetuating cycle of bullshit that they thought they could get away with. Sorry, they didn't count on the fact that like social media exists, the internet exists, and people point it out. So yeah, it was very interesting when it got given a term, and it just absolutely clicked for a lot of people. This is what they're doing, and they keep doing it time and time again.
I was so surprised that you would want to bait your customer base, and probably your most loyal customer base, by changing something so radically about the show that makes no sense whatsoever and has been done to make a political point, and then almost being like, okay, well, we're actually going to benefit off the back of making this change, and there's nothing you can do about it. Now, they benefit to a short extent, and they may a small extent, and they maybe gain in the short term support from legacy media and from different outlets and from the access media, but you're completely disenfranchising the people who have maybe put you in the position that you're in. And I find that such a short-term piece of thinking and such a silly strategy when you expand it out over many, many years, because you lose so much faith.
Yeah, because the one thing you can't ultimately do is force people to go and watch your crap product, and that's where the problems creep in. The other aspect of this, I think, is the people who tend to lash out most at fan criticism are the creatives. It'll be the writers, it'll be the actors, it'll be the showrunners or whatever, because they're not the corporate ones. They are just the people who are heavily invested in it ideologically. And quite a lot of the time, they're the people who have been brought in without the relevant experience and without the relevant skill to be able to make a good product in the first place. And so a criticism of the show or a criticism of the movie is a direct criticism of them as people, either their ideology, their worldview, or their actual skill at doing the things that they do. And so they lash out, and they lash out at the people that are supposed to be the paying customers. And I think this is probably like relations between studios and creatives and their own customers are probably at the lowest point they've ever been in the history of entertainment, particularly with certain companies like Disney. I think that's almost become a brand that has become popular to hate. And once you get that attached to your brand, your studio or whatever, it is almost impossible to shake it. This is why so many, like you said before, like the coverage of The Acolyte, for example, gets insane amount of traction on YouTube because it's a show that everyone was primed to dislike. And the fact that it's failing and it's been pretty bad creatively, it just justifies all of that animosity. So people are indulging in a bit of schadenfreude, I think, with that one. It was probably the same with the Marvels or Rings of Power, whatever.
Yeah, I mean, you've just named three absolutely shocking shows, to be fair, so I can certainly see why from that perspective. Now, these are massive negatives, and I think the vast majority is really, really poor. But I would guess there's probably two that spring to mind for me in terms of recent years that stood out in amongst the pile of crap. And first and foremost was definitely an actual remake, to be fair, or an extension to a franchise of Top Gun Maverick. I thought that was a real standout for something that spoke to what the audience were interested in. And guess what? They just delivered it without any nonsense. Why did that manage to sneak through and permeate our eyeballs?
I think it was because Tom Cruise was behind it. And when he's calling the shots on a movie, he is not going to be Luke Skywalkered. Particularly in a movie like, Top Gun, which is like essentially made his career. So no, you need a guy like him who can say, no, my character is older now, but he's still a hero. He still gets to kick ass and then pass the torch on to a younger generation. So they just absolutely nailed it with that one. And they gave people what they've been wanting for so long as an audience. An aging hero going on one last adventure, still being awesome, paired up with great action sequences and obviously a lot of effort put behind it. It was just like a glass of water after a trek through the desert. People were just loving it, and it was a great movie to watch. It actually made people feel good when they came out the cinema, And I remember when
That's what we're
films used to do
chasing as
that.
well.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. That was what people want. Whereas, like, if you look at some of the other live action remakes, you've got Aladdin, you've got Mulan, and you're just thinking, what on earth did you do to what was like considered quite a good film in my childhood? So I agree that Top Gun in particular was very much gave the people what they wanted and they came away satisfied. And that's one where the Rotten Tomato score is higher from the audience than it is from the critics. And you're just thinking, you guys don't have a clue what people actually want to see, or you do, and you're just disregarding it.
Possibly, yeah. But then you've had this weird phenomenon this year where so many films that should have been good flopped. You know, the
Mm.
Fall Guy, perfectly fun action comedy, was expected to be one of the big hits that was going to kick off the summer movie season, kind of flopped. Furiosa, you know, continuation of the Mad Max saga, good action sequences, you know, pretty big stars in it. Again, flopped. Yeah, just a lot of unexpected failures. So I don't quite know what's going on this year with the summer movie season, but it's been an odd one.
The only other one I want to bring up with you, Will, is Iron Claw. And I know that you had a really favorable review of it on your channel. And when I was on the flight back from Dubai in May, I watched it because when I've seen somebody who I trust their opinion say they enjoyed it, I was really keen to go into that. And I think one of the things that stood out for me is that yes, there was elements of toxic masculinity from the father,
Mhm.
but positive masculinity as a brotherhood among the brothers was something that I related to really strongly. And I've had many guests speak before about the attack on masculinity by the mainstream media and the kind of feminizing of society. That was like a kind of pushback on that from my perspective. And I'm glad that I took the time to watch that when I was sat up in the sky.
Yeah, yeah, a really well constructed, heartfelt movie that I think treats its source material with a lot of respect. So I think what more can you ask for? Good cast of actors, good performances all round. Yeah, good stuff.
I think we can ask for more films like that.
Yeah, just give us good movies, man. It's like we're not that hard
It
to
would make
please.
it would make your job easier if there were more good movies than bad. Of course, people love to watch you rant and criticize and what else, but there's obviously lots of views that you've accumulated through when you're talking wholesomely about a film and how much you enjoyed it and why, and illustrating that. And it'd be great to see that balance being easier for you to do if they were better films.
For sure, yeah. I mean, it'd be good for my morale as well, like to actually just get to watch more good stuff. You know, that's always enjoyable. People say to me, you know, oh, you would struggle if there wasn't, you know, crap movies to lash out at. And I thought, well, one, there's always going to be bad movies because we've never been in a period where everything has been amazing. But two, no, yeah, I might not get quite as many views. I wouldn't care because it'd be nice to get just really, you know, good quality stories for me to get my teeth into. So
Yeah,
I'd be fine
and
with it.
like I would look to reviewers on everything for positive reviews, so I can make choices. So for restaurants, I go to somebody that's picking out good restaurants, not necessarily just like belittling or shaking down the ones that were terrible. Of course, I'll avoid those, but then I can also have a laugh at how they're written and whatnot. And one of the films that I'm keen to ask you about that's coming up, and I've got some reassurance about this because Peter Jackson's going to be producing them, but the next round of the Lord of the Ring films, which is 2026 on Gollum, how are you feeling about that?
I'm a bit confused about that movie, to be honest. So this is going to be the hunt for Gollum. So Andy Serkis, I think, is going to be directing it and starring in it, presumably as Gollum. Peter Jackson is going to be producing it. I think it's an odd story to focus on because it's like some kind of, I guess it's going to serve as a prequel to the Lord of the Rings movies because Gollum was captured and then escaped again prior to the events of that story for the most part. Yeah, just I'm not really sure what they can do with it and where they can take it because it doesn't feel like something that's got a huge amount of material there to support it. I hope it's good, I suppose. You know, it'd be nice to flesh out that world a little bit more. I suppose there's lots of stories within the Lord of the Rings framework that you can tell. You know, the Peter Jackson trilogy certainly didn't cover everything that was in the books, so maybe there's smaller stories, more character-driven stuff that you can do that's not just about the end of the world and the destruction of the ring. Yeah, I hope it lives up to the legacy of the other ones, and I hope it's better than the Hobbit movies.
Yeah, definitely better than the Hobbit films. I would hope so. But also, we had that Rings of Power series, which was
Yeah,
absolutely chronic.
yeah, that's coming back in like a month or so, I think.
How
Excitement
are they
is an
financing
all-time
that? Do you
low.
think? Yeah, I was going to say. I mean, it's going to give you plenty of content, well, but I really worry for what they're going to do with that. But yeah, I agree because there's. I mean, the Hobbit was a book in itself, and then they obviously had the Fellowship and the Two Towers, and then of course the Return of the King. You had full text there, but as you say, there's enough text within that they could maybe do something else, but not necessarily on Gollum's story prior to prior to the Fellowship of the Ring. I'm curious as to what they're going to build out on that, and I hope that they're true to some sort of tokenist content from that perspective.
We can hope so. I mean, if Peter Jackson's involved and he's got actually plenty of time to work on it, I think Andy Serkis is super invested in that character as well. So I imagine he's going to treat it with respect. So I guess hope for the best. But yeah, I'm always a bit nervous when they don't have direct material to reference and they essentially have to write their own story. That's when things can go quite horribly wrong. Just look at Game of Thrones, the later seasons. That's when they ran out of books and they had to start telling it for themselves. And oof, yeah, wasn't good.
They're not as good as the author. Yeah, I completely agree. And we haven't touched on this during our conversation, but you've spoken a lot about the death of superhero films, which was traditionally for the last few years been such a thing that's been lent upon. What do you think we'll go towards in terms of content that to replace that kind of large genre?
I think there's two possibilities. Either you're going to get just more generic, like action-y type movies or thrillers. Maybe the field's going to open up into a broader range of movies, or video game adaptations are going to be the next big thing. Which again leaves you with a lot of different options. It could be horror, it could be action, it could be adventure, whatever. There's plenty to choose from. But I think we've reached that point now where we're actually able to adapt video games to a pretty good standard, and they might finally be cracking the code for how to do it right. And so I think that's going to be the next big thing, because it essentially functions from a business point of view like doing a remake. You've got an inbuilt audience with strong brand recognition that you can capitalize. All you need to do is a good job. That's the big if. But I think there's a lot of potential there.
The challenge will lie is if they try and push identity politics and maybe change the gender or color or characteristics of some of these famous characters. I can just imagine a Legend of Zelda and they turn Link into a black man when we've just watched him grow up as a small Caucasian kind of Scandinavian looking young man.
Yep. Yeah, I wouldn't put it past them. And I know they have quotas to fill. They have boxes that they have to tick. It's just a question of, do you think you can actually get this past rabid fans that have been, in love with whatever game series it is for decades at this point? I think you won't, because gamers are the one group of people you absolutely don't want to piss off.
And they're not politically correct either, which, or typically, I can't speak for all of them, but they're very direct about what they enjoy.
I've been in plenty of
streams, and he said it's wild.
Yeah, I've been in plenty of Call of Duty lobbies. Like, they are not PC in the slightest.
Yeah, agreed. Well, is there anything else that you're excited for? Of course, we haven't even mentioned it with your own writing series, the Ryan Drake series. You've got your own film in the pipeline.
Yeah, that's almost ready to go. Actually, we've been doing all the post-production stuff for the past several months, and the soundtrack particularly, you have to get obviously composers in to put that together for you. So I've got a 95% complete version that I've been shown, which is good fun, and I'm very pleased with how it's turned out. So the hope is we release this. We're in conversations with a few studios and various people within the industry about potentially doing more stuff, getting funding to do a TV show or whatever, and we could start adapting the books. So I think there's a ton of material there. There's a ton of potential there, and we'll see how it plays out. But I'm excited that we got this opportunity, and I'm really looking forward to how people receive it. So
I think it is great because I'm sure from memory there's 9 books within the Ryan Drake series, so there's plenty to dive into. And as you say, it doesn't leave too much license to go and write different parts of the story which you wouldn't envisage happening whatsoever. And I think that's the fear for any author or writer, that things just suddenly ran out of control and you think that is definitely not how I wanted that character to be.
Yeah, so I'll make sure I've got a contract that gives me a bit of creative control over it, so they don't just turn Ryan Drake into a black lesbian or something for no reason. So yeah, we'll make sure it's done right if it gets done.
No doubt about it. Well, I've had a fantastic time. I'm sure the audience have enjoyed listening to this one as well. If you want them to continue the conversation with you, where should they head towards?
So you can find me on Twitter as The Critical Drinker, obviously. You can also find my YouTube channel, which again is The Critical Drinker. I've also got a gaming channel called The Critical Gamer, which I launched a couple of months back. So that's going to get more and more content added to it in the months ahead. So it's probably the best way to reach me and see what I'm doing now.
What's been happening in the gaming world, Will? Is it the same as the film world, or are we still winning over there?
It's starting to creep in quite a bit. It's probably more than I can cover in this stream here, but yeah, they've got consultancy firms who can basically come in and make sure that your game is more diverse and complies with the message. And I think you can guess what they suggest every single time. So that's
Mm.
starting to creep into gaming, and people are starting to notice it and push back against it, which is good to see.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear that. And maybe that's a conversation for another time. But thank you so much to you, Will, and thank you to the listener. I'll be back to speak to you all again very, very soon.